How you doing? My name is Jonathan Baldwin. I'm your instructor for public speaking or communication application. We need to start off with understanding human communication if we're going to understand the roles we have as public speakers in it. So, the notes for this chapter are available in Canvas. Make sure you print them out and have them available because you will be tested over this material. So let's get started. Feel free again to pause, move forward or back if you need to go over the material again or you missed something. So no doubt you have noticed that sometimes a word is used so indiscriminately that it begins to lose both its impact and meaning. Communication is such a word. On a very conservative level, people almost exclusively use the word communication in reference to their transactions with other people. But on a much more liberal level, people also use the word communication in reference to dealing with their pets, the handling of plants that decorate their home, and even the machines in their places of work. Few words in our everyday vocabulary are open to as many interpretations or as applicable to as many things as the word communication. A computer analyst may interpret a communication to mean the transference of electronic impulses from the computer's core memory to the machine that prints the computer's calculations. Yet a marriage counselor may interpret the same word to mean the transference of thoughts and feelings between a husband and wife. As if that were not enough, the word communication can be just as easily applied to an intercontinental television transmission via satellite as it can be applied to a young couple carrying on an intimate conversation in a secluded area of a park. It is a word so rich in meaning and so broad in scope that it can be interpreted however we like and applied to almost any of the processes we have directly or indirectly experienced. Although the broadness of use and interpretation may not seem to be a problem, let us assure you that it is. At the very least, it makes it difficult to determine the intended impact and meaning when a person uses the word communication. Also, the imprecise way people use this word has given rise to many misconceptions about communication. Therefore, in this chapter, we would like to begin our discussion of communication by examining some of the more common misconceptions people have about it and try to set the record straight. So, misconceptions. In working with business persons, students, and even other teachers, we have discovered that these groups of people frequently hold misconceptions that may undermine their communication endeavors. The most common misconceptions we have come across are that 1. We need more communication. 2. Communication eliminates problems. 3. Communication sometimes breaks down. 4. Words have specific meaning. And 5. You cannot communicate. Again, these are common misconceptions. So the idea that we need more communication. When working with organizational personnel, one of the most common complaints we've heard is that there is not enough communication in organizations. Frontline personnel complain that they seldom hear from the middle managers. Top executives complain that they have been isolated from those actually doing the work. And individual departments in complex organizations sometimes bicker about the non-existence of lines of communication between departments. More often than not, these complaints are justified. But is the problem one of not enough communication or one of quality? The truth of the matter is that most of us are confronted by too much rather than too little communication. From the moment we awaken, we are bombarded with messages from those with whom we live, those with whom we come in contact at school, people at work, and the mass media. The problem is that we are not psychologically equipped to handle all of these messages. While the eye is capable of processing somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 million bits of information per second, the brain can only compute about 500 bits of information per second. As a result, the probability of misinterpreting communication or communicating in an inappropriate manner is quite high. Alvin Toffler, the author of Future Shock, believes that the amount of communication in our environment has caused many of us to become super simplifiers, that is, people who take complex communications and grossly oversimplify their significance and meaning. The point is that the quantity of communication that characterizes an environment has little to do with the quality of communication in an environment. While there can be little doubt that we need to improve the quality of communication in our lives, we do not necessarily need more communication. Communication eliminates problems. In The Me Decade, Tom Wolfe relates a story about a couple who, after seeing Ingmar Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, decided their matrimonial problems could be solved if they would be more candid in communicating with each other. For starters, the husband told his wife she babbled and made little sense when meeting someone for the first time. While there is nothing so terrible about that, his wife told him that he'd never been toilet trained properly, and as a result, an undesired odor accompanied him wherever he went. From this point, the conversation became more vicious, and the couple was at last word in therapy. So more communication did not eliminate problems there. It actually made them worse when they disclosed more information to each other. Communication is not a cure-all for the problems we experience. Sometimes we just need to be silent. If we are properly skilled in communicating, it can be a highly effective medium for the resolution of problems or conflict. Unfortunately, many of us have failed to acquire sufficient skill in this regard. To assume we can eliminate problems effectively simply by being open and candid communicators, therefore, may be a mistake, because communication has the potential for creating or intensifying problems, as well as the potential for eliminating problems. Next is the idea that communication can break down. The idea that communication can break down is widely accepted. Generally, people assume that communication has been broken when one person has failed to accurately interpret the communication behavior of another person. While this frequently happens, it does not mean the communication has physically broken down. Rather, it means that we have been ineffective in communicating. Ineffectual communication usually is symptomatic of some deeper-seated problem between the communicators. When we accept the idea that communication can break down, however, we assume that communication is the problem. As a result, we are apt to try to treat the symptom of the problem. Treating the symptom instead of the real problem may accomplish little in the way of making us more effective communicators. Words and meanings. One or more of the mistakes that we make as communicators is to assume that the meanings we attach to a word will be the meaning everyone else attaches to the word. This is not always the case. The meanings we associate with words are a function of our individual backgrounds and experiences with other people. Because we cannot duplicate another's background or experiences with people, the meanings we have for the same words sometimes are quite different. To assume a word has only one meaning, therefore, may negatively affect our communication with other people. Consider a simple word like ball. In and of itself, the word means nothing. It's a series of symbols, and the meaning you attach to the word reflects your past, present, and projected experiences. If you are an athlete, for example, the word ball is probably associated with sports like football, baseball, basketball, soccer. If you are a debutante, however, the word ball is probably associated with a Sweet 16, bash, party, or dance. The point is a simple one. Words don't mean, people mean. That is to say, meaning can be very subjective. Consequently, you should not automatically assume that the meaning you associate with a word will be shared by those with whom you communicate. The degree to which you and others share common meaning for words will depend on the extent to which you share common backgrounds and experiences. Next is the idea that you cannot communicate. Have you ever made references about strangers while walking on a downtown sidewalk, or while in a crowded restaurant, or some other public place? Actually, that's supposed to be inferences. Do you realize that people make inferences about you in such places even though you have not tried intentionally to communicate to them? We bring this up because sometimes we assume that communication occurs only when we want it to occur. Actually, communication occurs any time meaning is stimulated in the mind of another person. Any time meaning is stimulated in the mind of another person. And, like it or not, we are constantly stimulating meaning in the minds of people who take notice of us. For example, when the person across the street, unbeknown to us, watches us as we make our way up the boulevard. Communication is not a light bulb that can be turned on and off with the flick of a switch. We need not even be present to communicate, in fact, if a person is aware of our absence. If an instructor is aware of your repeated absences in class, for instance, you have communicated something to the instructor. What do you think you've communicated? If you're continually absent or tardy. Then again, if you avoid the company of a group of people with whom you might be expected to affiliate, you also have communicated. In a very real sense, we cannot not communicate. Thus, we should try to be conscious of the fact that we may be communicating to people with whom we do not intend to communicate, or with people of whom we are not even aware. Our purpose in relating the preceding misconceptions is a simple one. When people assume something is so, they communicate as if the assumption is without fault. If a person believes that quantity and quality of communication are one and the same, that communication always eliminates problems, or that communication physically breaks down, the person will use these beliefs as a guide for communication behavior. Furthermore, these beliefs and the communication behavior they produce will undermine the person's effectiveness in communicating with people in the classroom, on the job, or in the home. Communication basics. Given the preceding framework, we can now turn to some of the basic concepts about communication that have been generated in the past 2 decades. They include the facts that communication is symbolic. Communication can be intentional or unintentional. Communication is multifunctional. Communication is disclosive. And communication involves acts, interactions, and transactions. So, symbolic communication, the verbal dimension. Realize that none of us live within what is called true reality. We live within the confines of our individual experiences and the meanings we attach to these experiences through our ability to communicate. Through this ability, also, we are able to share our experiences with others. When we attempt to share these experiences, we are limited in the sense that we can provide only symbols that approximate the experience. Whether we succeed in communicating will depend on whether the people with whom we communicate share the meaning we attach to those symbols. Unless an individual is familiar with the attitudes, beliefs, and experiences the person communicating has been through, they will have an improper frame of reference with regard to fully understanding the concept being expressed. Because you lack prior knowledge or experience, you have neither reference nor meanings for the symbols or vocabulary and what they are intended to communicate. Sharing our experiences on a verbal dimension is not the simple process we perceived it to be. The probability of 2 people being able to share and understand their respective experiences is limited to the extent that they share common meanings for the verbal symbols we call words. This brings us to the issue of communication fidelity. You see, communication fidelity is in bold, therefore it will be something specific as far as vocabulary is concerned on your test. Again, bold words and italicized words are something important to keep your eyes on. Fidelity concerns the degree to which people interpret each other's message as they were intended to be interpreted, as well as the degree to which their mental images correspond. One of the aims of this chapter and class is to increase fidelity with which the people in this class communicate. As you can realize, fidelity communication cannot be achieved unless the participants in communication have common meaning for the verbal symbols that they use. Your experiences, as well as those of others, are unique. In spite of their uniqueness, though, we are able to relate our experiences as well as share in the experiences of others through communication. If we are to be successful in either sense, however, we must try to be sure that people understand the verbal symbols we use and be sure we understand the verbal symbols they use. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve a high degree of fidelity in our communication transactions. Symbolic communication, the non-verbal dimension. Generally, we think about communication as a symbolic activity. We tend to view it as a process in which we translate our thoughts and feelings into verbal symbols that take the form of words. Human communication is symbolic in more than one dimension. In addition to our verbal symbol system, we also have a nonverbal symbol system. This nonverbal system is highly complex and every bit as, if not more, communicative as the verbal symbol system with which we are more familiar. Upward of 80% of all our communication behavior is nonverbal in nature. Moreover, we adults tend to believe what is communicated to us nonverbally when verbal and nonverbal symbols conflict. With this in mind, consider the primary 8 ways in which we communicate nonverbally. There's body movements, touch, physical appearance, vocal behavior, the use of space, the use of objects, eye behavior, and our use of time. Each of these functions of nonverbal behavior will be delineated in greater detail later in the class and thoroughly. Communication and intent. Just as we commonly think of communication as being a verbal phenomenon, we also tend to think of communication as being a wholly intentional phenomenon. Some would go as far as to say, in fact, that communication only occurs when one person intentionally engages another person for the purpose of eliciting a specific and predetermined response. Certainly, a significant portion of our communication behavior conforms to this perspective, but we seriously doubt if all of it does. Again, if you need to pause or go back, feel free to. I'm moving through this at a pretty brisk pace, I understand that. Again, feel free to go back or pause or re-listen to whatever you need to. Consider something as simple as dress, a nonverbal symbol that we will discuss in the future. You may wake up tomorrow morning feeling exceptionally good and decide to dress in a manner that you perceive reflects how you feel. Later in the day, someone may walk up to you and say, "Hey, you look good today." Thus, you have communicated to that person exactly what you had intended to communicate. The day after tomorrow, however, you might also wake up and feel exceptionally good, but find that you are 15 minutes late for your first class. As a result, you may dress without thinking about what you're putting on, forsake shaving or curling your hair, and rush blindly out the door. Later that day, the same person may walk up to you and say, "Are you sick? You really look bad." In other words, without intending it, the manner in which you dress may communicate, that is, stimulate meaning. This example serves to further emphasize something we said when discussing misconceptions about communication. Everything that is directly or indirectly associated with us can stimulate meaning in the mind of another person. Again, you cannot not communicate when in the presence of other people, because they will constantly assign meaning to your behavior whenever they attend to it or whenever they're paying attention to you. And they will do so in spite of the fact that your behavior is neither directed toward them nor intended to be meaningful. Communication and disclosure. The definition of disclose: to make known, to reveal or uncover, as though it were previously hidden or a mystery. Since you cannot not communicate, you are constantly revealing something about yourself to the people in your immediate environment. Hence, communication is disclosive. In a verbal dimension, your experience, manner of dress, and pattern of speech are just a few of the factors that disclose information about you. Your pattern of speech may disclose where you come from, your cultural background, or perhaps your ethnic origins. What you communicate verbally also discloses more about you than perhaps you want to disclose. At minimum, your verbal communication may disclose how educated, well-read, and how well-traveled you are. In addition, you may also be disclosing your attitudes, beliefs, and values. Also, realize that the people around you are disclosing information about themselves through communication. Moreover, this information may cause you to make inferences about these people that are inappropriate. While people may disclose unintentional, there is no substitute for face-to-face intentional communication. This holds for you as well as for those about whom you make inferences. Inference involves inferring something about another person or them about you. Based on what you see, you make an inference. Actions, interactions, and transactions. We can look at the communication event in at least 3 ways. We can look at the communication solely in terms of how our communication behavior affects the people with whom we communicate. When we view communication from such a perspective, we are concerned exclusively with the effect of A on B. This is an action perspective. And again, if anything's in italics, it's going to be on your test. Action perspective is concerned exclusively with the effect of A on B. How did this affect that? A second way of viewing communication is a form of interaction. The interactional model of communication is concerned with responses of a receiver to a source's message, as well as any effects the source's messages may have had on the receiver. Again, interaction is italicized, so that's an important word to know. While the interactional model was preferable to the action model, it still ignores many factors that are important to the ways in which people communicate. It does not attempt to account for the fact that there are seldom clear-cut distinctions between sources and receivers, or in the perceptions of the communicators, or in the environment in which the communication takes place. Communication is much more complex than any of these 2 models suggests. People communicate neither in social vacuums nor in clear-cut steps, where one person is assigned the role of source and the other is assigned the role of receiver. On the contrary, people communicate in noisy cafeteria lines, during emergencies such as a car accident, and other conditions of crisis and mental duress. Furthermore, under circumstances like these, one would be hard-pressed to say who is the source and who is the receiver. Therefore, communication can be termed transactional. Again, there's italicized. Transactional is italicized. In effect, this means that your communication behavior, as well as everyone else's, is influenced, shaped, and modified by people and the environment with which you come into contact. It's transactional. At minimum, for example, with whom you communicate will have a noticeable impact on how you communicate and what you communicate. And these will reflect a tripart perception that you have of the person with whom you are communicating. First, your communication behavior will be influenced by how directly you view that person. Second, your communication behavior will be influenced by how you think that person views him or herself. And finally, your communication behavior will be influenced by what you think that person thinks about what you think about him or her. It's a little complex, but if you think about it, you can break it down a little more easily. R.D. Laing and his associates refer to this tripart perception as a direct, meta, and meta-meta perspective. It needs to be an extra A right here. Your perception of the relationship existing between you and another person will have a tremendous impact on your communication behavior. Your judgments about how a person perceives him or herself and how that person perceives his or her relationship with you will also affect your communication behavior. The idea that communication is transactional goes beyond the tripart perception. It also implies that how you communicate and what you communicate to another person will be influenced by how and what the person communicated to you. So you need to remember direct, meta, and meta-meta perspective. Even as you formulate and transmit messages to another person, you are receiving and interpreting the nonverbal messages that the person is transmitting to you. This means you are engaged in the process of sending and receiving information simultaneously. Because you are receiving information, even as you are sending information, you are in a constant state of change and adaptation. That is to say, you are constantly changing and adapting your communication behavior toward a person on the basis of the communication behavior the person exhibits toward you. Finally, how you communicate and what you communicate to another person will reflect the environment in which the transaction takes place. It stands to reason that your perceptions of what is appropriate communication behavior in certain environments will influence what you say to a person. For example, in the privacy of your home, you may think nothing about berating a friend for some transgression he or she committed. But would you do the same thing in a library or a fancy restaurant? So the environment, like the people you come into contact with, to a great extent, helps determine how you communicate and what you communicate. Another example could be how loudly you speak at a football game compared to how loudly you speak in the classroom context. Functions of communication. One of the functions of communication, is needs satisfaction. Some of the other functions are directly tied to our needs. Some of the functions, are directly tied to our needs, and some are indirectly tied to our needs. Some of the functions that communications perform include affinity. Again, that's italicized, so keep that in mind. Much of our communication behavior is targeted at developing rewarding relationships with respect to associating and interacting. Krosky and Willis talk about this as communicating for the purpose of establishing affinity. Affinity is based on mutual perceptions of attraction and perceived similarities, and on the perceptions of commonness. When we meet someone we like, we want to avoid communication behavior that may alienate the person. As a result, we try to ingratiate ourselves to that person, or make yourself valuable to that person, make yourself more like that person. We communicate in an effort to find topics of common interest, to locate similarities in attitudes, beliefs, and values, and perhaps even flatter the person a little bit. Once we have established a relationship, we communicate in such a way that affinity will be attained. Information and understanding. Communication also assists us in acquiring and understanding information that is important to us and the people with whom we interact. When we are unsure about a comment made in class, we can ask a question, or at work we can discuss the reasons for policy change. Also, we can consult with experts in an attempt to better understand the reasons for our or another's behavior. The more we come to know and understand, the more likely it is that we will be successful in coping with and relating to our environment and the people in it. decision making. Rare is the person who is completely confident in individual decisions he or she makes. Most of us feel comfortable with our decisions when we have consulted beforehand with competent and responsible people. Prior to the start of school, we may seek advice about the classes we should take, or at work we may consult with those we respect before making a decision. And in our relationships, we may consult our partners before taking action that might affect the relationship. Communication not only makes consultation with others possible, but also increases the confidence with which we make decisions. Confirmation and adaptation. Communication is also the means by which we determine whether a decision was correct or incorrect. For example, if we decide on a career in medicine, vote for a presidential candidate, or make a long-term relational commitment, we can assess the appropriateness of our decision on the basis of subsequent communications. If your instructors reinforce you for your work in pre-med, if the president presents his or her office in a manner with which you approve, and if your relationship continues to thrive, the beliefs underlying your decisions will be confirmed. Even if you make the wrong decision, you can adapt to the situation on the basis of what is being communicated to you. Consistency. People like things in their lives to be consistent. They like their friends to get along with each other, their coworkers to share their orientations toward mutual tasks, and their children to hold on to their attitudes, beliefs, and values. As long as people's lives are characterized by consistency, there should not be many problems. When people experience inconsistency, however, they also experience psychological discomfort. How do we resolve this psychological discomfort? We seek out social support for our decisions, such as buying a car, by communicating with significant other people. In the car example, someone may show the car to a friend or consult with a trusted mechanic. If the friend heaps praise on the car and the mechanic informs you that you made a superior choice, the psychological consistency can be restored. We look for communicative support from other people to balance our dissonance. It may be restored as a function of communication transactions with people. In addition to satisfying people's needs, communication assists in developing and maintaining affinity, in acquiring and understanding information, in decision-making, in confirmation and adaptation, and in maintaining psychological consistency. Describing communication. What things are involved in human communicative transactions? Personal and interpersonal needs. Although it seems otherwise, people do not communicate because they are in love with the sound of their own voices. People communicate because communication is, in and of itself, a basic human need, and because communication is the medium, or segue, by which all other human needs are satisfied. A person's communication behavior is the outgrowth of the personal and interpersonal needs he or she experiences. No one wants to be a pest or a nuisance, even though it may seem that way. Later on, we're going to learn what a stroke is. Well, according to Bernet, a stroke is some kind of attention or recognition. Attention is attention. A stroke is a stroke. Recognition is recognition. We'll learn more about that in our conflict chapter. Try to be sensitive to the fact that a person's communication behavior, no matter how bothersome, is symptomatic of a deeper-seated psychological state. Environmental factors. What happens once we recognize, consciously or unconsciously, that a person personal or interpersonal need exists? Do we articulate the need the best we can and hope that it will be satisfied by chance? Usually, people attempt to structure their communication behavior in such a way that it increases the likelihood of the need being satisfied. People do this by surveying, identifying, and evaluating the verbal and nonverbal cues in our environment that have meaning for us. To make the point clear, consider Maslow's need for belongingness in two very different environments. Say a local hangout where you spend Friday afternoons following classes, and a formal dinner party that you have been invited to attend. Social conventions at the hangout are of little importance to belongingness. Knowing this, you dress with indifference, perhaps drink or eat sweets to exuberance, and talk with careless abandon. Social convention at the formal dinner party, however, are of utmost to satisfy your need to belong. As a result, you plan to exhibit an entirely different pattern of behavior than that exhibited in the local hangout. That is, you plan dressing on the basis of social convention, drinking or eating within the acceptable limits of social convention, and talking as dictated by social convention. The previous example highlights 2 points. First, the way in which we structure our communication behavior to satisfy a particular need depends largely on the meaning we attach to the verbal and nonverbal cues in our immediate environment. Second, different environments very often provide us with different sets of verbal and nonverbal cues. Therefore, the set of communication behaviors we exhibit will also tend to differ. This points out that communication is transactional. Feedback. The probability of our needs being completely satisfied ultimately depends on our skills in processing the verbal and nonverbal cues in our environment and formulating messages or communication behaviors that accurately reflect these cues. Using the preceding example, this would mean that the satisfaction of the need to belong would depend on how accurately you interpreted the verbal and nonverbal cues in the two environments and whether the communication behavior you exhibited was consistent with the cues. But how do you know if your interpretation of the verbal and nonverbal cues in your environment is accurate? How do you know if the message strategy or the communication behavior that you adopt and exhibit is consistent with the informational cues in a particular environment? It's feedback. Again, feedback is italicized, so something you might want to hold on to. That word's not going to go anywhere this entire semester. Feedback is made of external communication cues that occur during and following a communication attempt. You come to know whether your interpretation of informational cues is accurate and whether your message strategy is appropriate by feedback. If you experience hunger, you then communicate that fact and are subsequently fed, you have some grounds for saying that your interpretation was accurate and that your message strategy for communication behavior was appropriate. Thus, you would probably reinterpret the verbal and nonverbal cues in your environment and formulate a different message strategy in the attempt to satisfy your need for food. The importance of feedback in communication cannot be minimized. Feedback increases perceptual accuracy among transactants and thereby increases the fidelity with which you communicate. Remember, fidelity is the degree to which you and the person you're communicating with your ideas correlate. Feedback also affects our confidence in communicating. If one person receives negative feedback from another person, it will decrease the communicator's confidence about his or her message. If the feedback is positive, however, it will increase the communicator's confidence. People are more confident in their interpretations of a communicator's message when they're able to provide the communicator with feedback. There's the definition of supersimplifying. Again, definitions, lists of things, bold lettering, italicized lettering. Those are things that are important, and you need to keep those in mind that they'll be on your test. The definition of supersimplifying is the tendency to minimize the significance of complex communications as well as distort their meaning. Communication breakdown, a common term people use when they have trouble making other people understand them. Communication fidelity, the definition, the degree to which people interpret one another's messages as they are intended to be interpreted, the degree to which the mental images of people correspond when communicating. There's the definition of transaction. This term refers to the fact that communication between people is affected by their immediate surroundings, their perceptions of each other, and their verbal as well as nonverbal messages. So, I think that's it for understanding human communication, the first chapter that you're going to have a test over. Please see me if you have questions about when the test will be. That should be posted on here as well. But thanks for paying attention, and I'll see you in class.